of all, welcome to the first Connections presentation from College of Southern Maryland. There's three during the semester. This is the first one here at Leonardtown. The novelist Sunil Yapa will be in Prince Frederick campus on March 3rd. These always take place Friday at 7:30. Great novel. I've read this. I recommend it highly. And the poet Frank X. Walker will be at the La Plata campus on April 7th. And then on May 5th, there'll be a reading of the Connections Literary Magazine, which is a student, faculty, community literary magazine. Anybody who's interested in sending in material to be considered for that, you can come to our website, csmd.edu/connections, and there's procedures for, is that where they submit the Connections material? So poems, stories, creative essays, photographs, artwork. It's a really nice magazine, and everybody gets together and reads from it at the end. I'd like to welcome my friend Michael Archer here. It's a real treat for me to have him. He is a Marine veteran of the Vietnam War. He's the author of two books on Vietnam, A Patch of Ground, and the book he'll be speaking about tonight, The Long Goodbye, Khe Sanh Revisited. In my, I did an endorsement for Mike's book, and on it I wrote, "Marines don't leave their dead behind," goes the old adage. And Mike Archer demonstrates the truth of that statement and the double edge of its meaning. The double edge, of course, is that we continue to carry the dead with us. And in truth, the truth is that those who die in war, our own dead or the dead we make, don't leave us behind. That's the price war extracts from its survivors. For Mike, as he will recount tonight, it was his friend Tom Mahoney, his mysterious death and the disappearance of his remains, who was the dead he could not leave behind. Yet Tom is also the face of all that we lost, all who we lost. We, those of us in that war and in other wars, all have our own Tom Mahoneys. Mine was a boy named Jim Childers, who for a reason I didn't find out for decades later, switched places with me on a mission during our last week of the war and was killed. We were helicopter gunners, and he literally died in my seat, in my place. Like Tom Mahoney and like all the others, they all died in my place, and in your place, and in your name. When I think about what makes Tom and Jim's and the other deaths in the Vietnam War continue to haunt us, besides the simple fact of their absence and the lives that, unlike us, they were not allowed to have, I'm drawn to the title of the book by the concentration camp survivor Viktor Frankl. His title was Man's Search for Meaning, and his thesis that both survival in a death or life situation and the desire to live one's life afterwards depend on whether one has or can create a sense of meaning. In war, we need all of the sacrifices, all the suffering, all the death to mean something. The Vietnam War made that need very hard to obtain and sustain. Mike writes and will tell us of the siege of Khe Sanh and the battles for the hills around it that took place over 15 months and in which over 2,000 Americans were killed and 8,000 wounded, and in which there were over 50,000 North Vietnamese dead and wounded. The last American to die on one of those hills, 881 South, was Mike's friend Tom Mahoney. Mike writes of the sense of sickening betrayal he and other Marines, sailors, soldiers, airmen who had died and bled on Khe Sanh combat base and in those hills felt when General Westmoreland, the commanding officer in Vietnam, ordered them to be simply abandoned, the last deaths occurring in utterly valiant and utterly useless battles during that abandonment. He writes of the way that sense of betrayal deepened when years later, studying the war, he found that the siege and those battles were all insisted upon by Westmoreland against the advice of other commanders, that all the deaths had accomplished nothing, that those last battles in which his friend died occurred because the commanding officer was saving face before moving on to his next promotion. It was the deep sense of betrayal when authority one should trust, the commander, the president, the country, feels you can be discarded like garbage. It is the sense of betrayal Mike came to feel about Khe Sanh, and that I came to feel about the war itself, which was Khe Sanh writ large. The lives of thousands more sacrificed after 1969, when President Nixon, as we've recently found out, in his bid to be elected, sabotaged Johnson's peace talks with the North Vietnamese, because wrapping up the war would have advantaged Johnson in the election. Our lives meant nothing. It is that kind of betrayal that strips away the sense of meaning one can have in war if one feels the sacrifices are in the service of something meaningful, of a meaningful cause, a cause worthy of belief. When that's gone, all you have are two contradictory, pulling emotions. The first is the desire for individual survival. And the second is an intense loyalty to those who are sharing the experience with you. That love for each other becomes the meaning you infuse into the situation. That love for each other is what replaces or becomes the love your country should have for you. That love for each other is what led Mike to his search for Tom. It is a quest for answers that, like all such searches, is a search for meaning. Perhaps the final meaning we can and must take from that bloody war, the saving grace, is to bring its lessons back to our families, communities, country. That is what Mike is here to do. Sometimes it is enough. Sometimes, if it feels one country still does not want to listen, if you feel there's no place for you here, as Mike will recall of another friend, it is not. I give you Michael Archer. I ask you, find a place for him. Open your hearts and minds and listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a reason that Wayne Carlin has been an inspiration and a model for me for many years. His words were cutting right to the truth. It's always about the truth. And thank you. I'd like to thank Wayne, of course, for seeing me get here. Neil Dwyer for arranging it all and shepherding me around, and all the staff and faculty members of the College of Southern Maryland. I couldn't feel more welcome. What I'd like to do this evening, as Wayne indicated, before I do a reading of a few short excerpts from the book, I'd like to familiarize you with the characters that I'm talking about. As Wayne so eloquently stated, the Battle of Khe Sanh was ill-conceived, to say the least. It was fought close to the enemy's supply lines, which in neutral Laos along this border was only 7 miles from Khe Sanh. It was fought in actually the wettest, rainiest spot in the rainiest part of the year in Vietnam. We had ground fog where we could literally see across a road. The enemy came, and and I won't belabor the background history, but simply to say the war had been grinding down into a quagmire by mid-1967 when the Marines took the hills around Khe Sanh to secure it. And both the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by a militarist by then, and Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and General Westmoreland wanted a knockout punch. And they both chose this place, coincidentally. The North Vietnamese thought they could take the base, as they had against the French, and the Americans thought that they could annihilate them once they drew them out in the open with our superior bombing. Both things didn't come to pass, but one thing I'd like to point out here, though, is again, you hear the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It skirted the western border of Vietnam, and it was a sanctuary because Laos was ostensibly a neutral country, although U.S. troops operated there. U.S. troops that operated in there, actually some of them worked directly out of offices in the State Department, Pentagon, couldn't bring with them any identification, so that it didn't look like if they were captured or even killed, that we were abrogating the treaty. And I found an interesting fact. In the 15th century, there was a border treaty along here, and the North Vietnamese government, they decided to, or they claimed that under that treaty, the country of Vietnam was 6 miles farther west than the current borders. And consequently, that validated their claim that we're actually on our hereditary ground instead of a neutral country. I find it kind of legalese, kind of amusing in the middle of a war. This is a Quezon combat base from a CH-34 helicopter just before the siege. Again, it was in an area that was not easily defended, not easily supplied. There was no road in there, as an example. The North Vietnamese had effectively cut off ground supplies. And so we were, I arrived there on December 8th of 1967, just a few weeks before they surrounded us and attempted to take the combat base. As I said, the supply road was closed, and on January 21st, they attacked the base. I happened to be in a village outside of Quezon. I was a new guy. I was new meat, and this is true. People there that had been there longer and were closer to going home knew we were going to get overrun, so they sent myself and another brand new Marine down there. That was the rules of the game, and we survived it. I got out of there after 2 days. It was an overwhelming North Vietnamese force. And they were bent on taking the village because the district headquarters were, for the South Vietnamese district and in the province of Quang Tri were there. And it would have been, and came to be, once we skirted out of there, a great propaganda coup because it was the first seat of government that was captured by the communists in South Vietnam and part of their plan. They surrounded us, started shelling us. Their anti-aircraft guns were very effective, so much so that they shot down several cargo planes that were supplying us. Here's a dramatic picture that a friend of mine, Joe Haggard, who was an excellent amateur photographer, took along the runway. You can kind of see the chaos down there with a plane that had been stitched by anti-aircraft fire and crashed on the runway. Subsequently, they stopped resupplying us by airplanes landing, and we were supplied by parachutes and to some degree helicopters. And all this, I read a lot when I was a young man, and before I went to Quezon, I'd read a book by Bernard Fall called Hell in a Very Small Place. So I knew about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which ended the French occupation of Vietnam. And this was a picture that could have come right out of that. I don't know why I keep doing this, but the siege of Quezon, which was between the months of January and April, the battle was, it was sandwiched between two ferocious battles before, as Wayne pointed out, before the base was abandoned. It really took on the feeling of a World War I battleground. It was raining, it was muddy. We lived in rat-infested bunkers that we made ourselves, so there was no engineering involved. We were constantly bombarded by artillery, and we were trying to give it back to them as much as we could, but all very much World War I. And as you can see here, I hope, this is where my bunker was, right there. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. So it's very close to our lines here. A couple of rock throws would have gotten you there. And we put the South Vietnamese Army came up here, and so this was friendly lines too. This is a graphic indication of how the American military felt about the South Vietnamese Army. We didn't trust them, so we put them in front of us in case they retreated so we could drive our allies there back. And Wayne and other Vietnam vets here know what I'm talking about. It's a sad situation when you not only don't trust the civilian population for whom you're fighting, but you don't entirely trust the Army. And I want to leave that with a caveat that I have met very many incredibly dedicated former soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and so I don't want to paint them all with the same brush. But it was whether it was a paranoia on our part, largely, it didn't matter. They were out here. Well, the thing I want to show you is these are trench lines right here and here that the North Vietnamese Army sappers built every night. And we would bomb them, and then they would get out and dig at night and come closer and closer to our wire. And I've talked to several, I'll introduce you to a couple in just a moment, who told me they could actually hear our conversations out of our bunkers and smell our cigarette smoke if it was blowing in the right direction. So, and every once in a while, an officer would order up a 4A into their, especially up here by the main gate, to go across the road and attack them. And it would always end up in enormous loss of life. And the North Vietnamese would occasionally probe us en masse. And again, it was a very scary situation. I mentioned the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, just a couple of photographs because I'll allude to one later when these gentlemen are older. But the architect of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a general by the name of Nguyen Vo Giap. And this is Ho Chi Minh here. And this is a photo op they took probably after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu but I knew about that, and I saw the similarities as many of us did, and the press was always drawing upon those similarities that we were going to fall much the same. And you know, General Navarre of the French forces actually took the same tact as General Westmoreland did with us. He put us up there as bait to lure the enemy out in the open, feeling he could destroy them with artillery. And much the same as our situation, it was a bad idea, and it wasn't that ancient history. It was only 16 years before. It's unfathomable to me now that someone who was a strategist, a military strategist, would not recognize the vulnerabilities, but evidently he did not. This was another picture that I'd seen before that. This is the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese Communist Army overrunning the main bunker at Dien Bien Phu and sealing their fate. And I worked in the radio bunker, or the main bunker at Khe Sanh. And this is a chilling thought to think of, and especially you saw how close they were to our lines. It would have been no more than a few-minute run once they cut the wire into the base. Much of what happened in the Vietnam War happened as a result of bad decisions by commanders on both sides. And I fully feel that once they had staged that close to Khe Sanh and not come for us, that they sealed their own fate. But this is just a picture of a piece of communications equipment. I was a radio operator that we had there, and this is after a few incoming rounds ditched it. And this was always a reminder to us. We'd have to see this every day, moving from one place to the other, about what would happen to us if we stayed in one place too long. We took anywhere from 150 to 1,300 rounds of artillery a day. Some days we couldn't even go outside to, take care of nature's call. It was so dangerous. This is me in front of my rat-infested bunker, which was, as you can see, was built just haphazardly. It would not have withstood a mortar round, a sizable mortar round. And we felt, I guess, safe because it was dark in there. So, but as you can see, we didn't wash, and I was filthy. There was shrapnel holes through the poncho there to keep the rain out. It was not well thought out by our superiors on how we were going to get by. This is a picture. I want to stop and elaborate on what you're seeing here. We had talked about this earlier today. I'm asked a lot. Well, I was 19 here. Weren't you scared? It must have required a lot of courage to withstand this. And I gave it a lot of thought. I forgot. I pushed the war out of my mind until I decided to write about it. And I'll get to the reasons for that in just a moment. But I often wondered, was I scared? How did I survive this? The problem is when you're in a bunker that you can't withstand a shell, you somehow know that every moment, any moment, you could be dead. There was no safe place to hide. So this is a picture of me in a chair that we took 4 chairs out of the officers' club as kind of a, to show our, I don't know, resentment or whatever as young kids. And this was the last chair that survived and that wasn't blown up. And as you can see, there's a 55 gallon drum here that was hit pretty close with an artillery round. That's pretty heavy metal. There's shrapnel all over the ground here. This building was blown up. My point being that we weren't really scared, I think, after a point. And no one can analyze themselves. But I came to believe after listening to a tape recording of a friend of mine made right after we almost were killed by an incoming round, that we just kind of became indifferent to it. And this smirk here, I mean, we were joking all the time, just like kids. It was, it's hard to explain at my age what it was. But the truth is, we weren't scared. We were probably too dumb to be scared. But we just settled into this indifference that, it's going to go away sooner or later. And if it doesn't, we're not going to make it. Sorry. This is a terrain model. I showed you the map that General Giap and Ho Chi Minh were looking at Dien Bien Phu. We all believed, and to a certain extent, they did attempt exactly the same methods at Khe Sanh. President Johnson, he was so upset by what was occurring there after the siege began that he had a terrain model made, and he pored over it. And some say that that he was down there at night in his bathrobe in the Situation Room, poring over this terrain model, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. He had been in the U.S. Senate at the time Dien Bien Phu fell, and he had voted against any further assistance for the French. There were actually even plans for tactical nuclear weapons by the United States against the Viet Minh. And I think Johnson was kind of haunted by that idea. This is kind of an interesting story I wanted to pass along to you. A few years ago, I went to San Antonio, Texas, and for a reunion. And we went up to the Johnson Library in Austin. And the curator there was kind enough to dig into the archives and find this. And it had not been opened since the picture you saw in Life magazine there, that President Johnson was looking at it. So it was really thrilling. And the curator, Mr. McDonald, said, he said, gentlemen, he said, you can stay here as long as you want. You can take pictures. You can get close to it. All I ask is that you don't touch it. And when I got this picture back, I realized why I didn't make the military a career, because there are my fingers right on it. I guess I just had a problem obeying direct orders. But yeah, and my friends who were there, and these guys were red case on, they were all like, yeah, that's him. I'm going back. Okay, now to my friend Thomas Mahoney. I got here in December, and Tom Mahoney got there to Vietnam. We were in boot camp together. We'd gone to high school together. Tom Mahoney was my hero, and I of course, didn't want to admit it because that was in 1968. You know, it's a guy thing and everything. But he was, in fact, and one day he was fed up with his life, and in Oakland, California, where we grew up. And I happened to drive by. He was working on his motorcycle, and I was driving a delivery truck at the time, and I happened to turn onto a street just by fate. And he came over and said, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. Do you want to go with me? And honest to God, I said, sure, why not? I didn't give more than 1 second to the lifelong consequences that that decision would cause. And I don't think many people did then, but it just goes to show you, we thought it was going to be a grand adventure. You know, as we were talking about earlier, we were raised to have a bit of a social conscience and make a sacrifice, and you know, that was all very noble in our minds. And not to say that's a bad thing, but we were caught up in that, and we chose the Marine Corps because the Marine Corps builds men, and we thought, boy, you know, we're going to come out of there and we're going to be, you know, men in the traditional sense of the word. And the Marine Corps is different, and it did a lot of good for me. You know, that reminds me of a humorous aphorism about the Marine Corps that goes, if a person was in the Marine Corps, studied at Harvard, or is from Texas, you'll learn about it in the first 5 minutes of a conversation with them. And I think we've all had that experience, but yeah. So you're a Marine for life too. But unfortunately, my friend Tom Mahoney's life didn't last much longer. This is a picture of when we graduated from high school. He's a nice kid. One of the questions at the round table today was really interesting. I hadn't gotten it before, and asked me, was he really that nice a guy? And the thing is, we were in high school together, and I admired him, but there's a different value system there. But when he got to his platoon in Vietnam, I found out many years later just how well thought of he was. And you know, no one wants to speak unkind of the dead, but I would contact, when I was doing the research for The Long Goodbye, I contacted these folks. I found quite a few of them. I found probably 9 or 10 of them, 3 or 4 who were very close to Tom, and they all said and when I started talking to them, 3 or 4 of them started crying. And it was all there. It was all right on the surface. All I had to do was just scratch it a little bit about what a nice guy was. And quite frankly, not everybody that you were with in the military was a nice guy or an honest guy or someone you could depend on. But he was. And that made this story even more poignant when I found out that to the day he died, he was so well thought of. Oh, I'm going to get this right yet. This is us growing up, and again, I just want to show we had a wonderful life. This is at South Lake Tahoe, California. Enjoying it, and for some reason, a month later, we decided to give it all up and go to Vietnam. This is our graduation picture. I just want to show you, again, this is Tom here. And this is me. He loved the Marine Corps from the minute he was in it. And again, you saw that picture of my finger on President Johnson's sand table. I started counting my days, but I did my duty, and that's all you ask. I just didn't like doing it. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I won't take my finger up this time. This is a picture of him about a month before he died, and just before, or excuse me, about 3 months before he died, just before he came up to Quezon. First, he went to a place called Contienne, and the only reason I'm going to show you these next two slides is, you know, as Wayne said, Tom died under very mysterious circumstances. He was a seasoned veteran. He had fought in this place called Contienne in 1967, was the worst place to be in Vietnam. Tom survived that. He then, in February of 1968, he survived the Battle of Hue City. He went in, his platoon had 38 men when they went in there. And in fact, they blew the bridge up behind them, they being the Viet Cong. So they were the last unit in initially. And after 1 week, there were only, he was one of only 9 people that wasn't killed or wounded. So it was a brutal battle. This is a picture you didn't see in the press at the time, but this is a Marine squad that paid a dear price for trying to take this street. Oh. This is and the reason I'm kind of moving along here is I'm going to get to my return to Vietnam in a minute. I just want to give you a little visual background. This is this is Hill 881 South, and what happened, as Wayne alluded to, finally after enormous loss of life, it was realized that we could never hold this place, and Marine generals and some Army generals, like to his credit, General Creighton Abrams, advised General Westmoreland that this was a seriously bad idea. This is one of the furthest outposts, and one of the last hills to go. The base was actually abandoned. The last convoy, they opened the road up, and the last convoy went out the night before. My friend Tom had gotten a Dear John letter from a girl he cared for very much, and he had written me 2 days before, not mentioning the letter, but he was incredibly distraught about being the Marine unit that had to give it up. I know it probably doesn't mean that much, but it did to them. They didn't want to be the last guy out. And so on the morning or the afternoon of July 6th, he went to his squad leader and thanked him for being an excellent squad leader and a good listener. And he walked out through the wire and was shot by a team of NVA waiting for the abandonment. They were waiting there to shoot the helicopter down that was taking them out. So at that point, I didn't know, and even for years later, I didn't know how my friend died. I just knew that he had. His dad, Thomas Patrick Mahoney II, had been killed in active duty in the Korean War and was buried in the National Cemetery in San Francisco. And what his mom decided to do was have his name engraved on the back. So I came home, and I wanted to forget it like most vets did. I was, as you can imagine, I had to face his mom, who was widowed as a result of the Korean War, and his sister, and it was incredibly heartbreaking. And so I went on and just decided, like most vets, to bury it away and move on. And but it didn't go away. And some of the more acute problems related to PTSD went away. But I eventually, my life just kind of spiraled away, and I think I was just filled with this venom for so long. I wanted to hate anyone I could find, you know, Jane Fonda, the North Vietnamese, anything, you know. And what I didn't realize until a few years later is that I didn't really know what I had done, you know. I knew what I was told to be there in boot camp and a lot of rumors, but I never really understood it. Well, to make a long story short, my life kind of spiraled away. I hit rock bottom. I ended up in a divorce. I didn't want to lose my young children, and so I just, at that moment in my life, I said, you know, I have to reevaluate everything I believe. Because if I don't, I'm gone. I'm going to be disappearing. And so I did. And so I actually went and I loved history. I'd read a lot of history. And so I understood how that worked. And I systematically reevaluated everything from the get-go. I took every premise that I believed in and tested it to see if it was correct. And most of them weren't. And so at that point, I started when I got past that, and it took a few years, I was very liberated by that. And that's what I said, you know what? The thing that had held me back from writing was I didn't want to expose myself, my feelings, to anyone. And that's probably what ended my marriage. But once I got past that, I decided I could do that. It all opened up. And then I realized that I did not know how my friend died. And I had not wanted to know. And so I started asking questions, and one thing led to another, one connection led to another, and that's what the Long Goodbye is really about. It's a series of incredible, unanticipated connections, and that's another lesson that I'd love to pass on to anybody. When you don't want to know, you never ask questions, but every question I asked took me in a direction that I just could not have foreseen, and it was amazing. And I kept going and going, and now I was unafraid to learn this. I didn't know how I would react if I ever had to confront my enemy. But I wrote the Apache Ground, a memoir, and it came out in 2004. And then I wrote a political history of Nevada, which took me years to research and do. And then about that time, North Vietnamese records were becoming available, which they had not been. So it was really fortuitous that I set myself on another course for a while. And I suddenly realized I had to find out. And my readers from Apache Ground almost invariably asked me, what happened to Tom Mahoney? And I was embarrassed to say, I didn't want to know, so I didn't know. So I started to meet people that were in his unit, and in December, and then I went to the U.S. government, and they'd been making efforts to find Tom, but not effective efforts. In fact, they were making inept efforts, and it's just not my opinion. They were finally called to task by a congressional committee, and their management was completely sacked, and a new agency was turned over. But what they were telling me is, we can't find him. So I didn't know what to do. And then into my life came Robert Doc Totmiller, this man here. He was my corpsman, our corpsman at Quezon, and he endured a great deal of misery there. As an example, corpsmen are usually trained to, what little training they get is to treat in and out bullet wounds, nice clean things. But at Quezon, everything was gashing shrapnel wound, infections, blindness and burns. There was a lot of incendiary artillery, and he couldn't save everybody, and so he was having great difficulty. He'd gone to Vietnam and faced his demons. He'd become a Buddhist, and so when we reunited, he said, I told him the situation. He said, well, let's do things the Vietnamese way. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, and then he explained to me the concept of wandering souls, the concept that the Vietnamese often feel they can find remains of their war dead by contacting their wandering souls. They believe that a soul will wander unhappily until it's reunited with its family plot, or at least honored. A lot of times it's just a simple ceremony. It doesn't have to be reburied. But in December 2007, I told Doc I'd keep an open mind. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I said I will do anything. And so I did the one thing I never thought I'd do. I went back to Vietnam. I'd sworn an oath that I never would, and my friend Steve Orr here, who was also a Quezon vet, we went back. And I have to tell you, for those of you that haven't and are carrying some issues around, it was absolutely incredible. And I didn't foresee that either. So when I went back, one of the things I knew that I'd have to do is I'd have to confront some former enemies, North Vietnamese soldiers, and I had no idea how I would react. Before we went in to talk to the telepath, who was going to try to contact Tom's wandering soul, I met this gentleman, and his name is Dr. Din Tuan, and I'm still in communication with him. Dr. Din Tuan, you saw that slide I showed earlier, that North Vietnamese trench line. Just past that, he was wounded at Quezon, right outside our Doc and I's wire. I mean, if he had stood up, we probably could have seen him. That's how close it was. He was badly wounded, so badly wounded, the North Vietnamese rarely took people back north. They took him north because he was deafened and he had internal injuries. Well, he was also a brilliant scientist, and when they realized that, they sent him to the University of Moscow to study. He got his doctorate in geophysics and returned to Hanoi to become the director of the geophysical department there. He was sponsored, kind of hosting us for this event. He speaks English perfectly, and so he came down to see us and introduce himself, and he looked at us and he went, you know, we're all very lucky. And the three of us, former American soldiers, we teared up, and I didn't know that would be the reaction, but the word "we," you know, I mean, a former enemy using the word "we" it staggered me. I didn't know what to think, but it was the icebreaker, and I still communicate with him. I sent him a Kindle version of the book recently, and yeah, Dr. Din Tuan is an amazing guy. So he took us upstairs to a room in the geophysical department, in the hard sciences department, and to a room for what they call the Center for the Investigation of Human Capability. And what this was, kind of interestingly, as I found out later in my research, you know, the communist government and Marxism in general, they had to keep a certain distance from supernatural and so forth, that they keep their ideology pure. But what they did, they made a nice compromise. They said, well, so many people after the war ended in the North, so many people wanted to know what happened to the million missing that they had in the war. And there was an outcry, and the government didn't know quite what to do. So what they did is they called this, rather than soul callers or mediums or telepaths, they called it people who practice extrasensory perception. And this allowed them to kind of keep within the precepts of their ideology and not extend it to the supernatural. This gentleman here is Dr. Din Tuan, excuse me. His name is also Tuan, different spelling, Nguyen Bu Tuan, a 33-year-old young man, just a wonderful guy, very dedicated to what he does. And this was the first American that anyone had tried to, American soul, to bring it forward. And again, the idea is to bring Tom here, and Tom would lead them to his remains and a happy conclusion. As you can see here, they asked me to bring something that was very close to Tom, and so I brought his old baseball glove. And Mr. Tuan, you know, it had some effect. He's drawing a map here. In this picture, he's actually communicating with Tom's spirit. And so I was sitting about where the camera angle is. My friend Steve was taking the pictures, and when he was done, he said to me, "Your friend's here in the room. Do you feel him?" And I was quite honest. I really wanted to feel him, but I said, "No, I don't." He asked me to concentrate, and I still could not feel the kind of a physical effect that he thought I should feel. And so, without batting an eye, he said, "I'll go up to the hill with you," and at his expense, and they never charged a penny. The thing here that I had to point out is I was really fearful of going back to Vietnam for a lot of reasons. I didn't want to re-engage bad memories. I didn't want to see the faces of people that we had, that we had fought and destroyed their cities and destroyed their families. But it was nothing like that. And that even made it worse. I found them to be very generous. Their culture requires them to be very generous and courteous, and that hurt the most because even though many of them had not participated in the war, it's a very young country. About 75% of the people there were not even born when I was there in 2007. But nonetheless, kind of made me go, what were we thinking here? So he went up to the hill with us, that picture 881, and this is a picture of him consulting one of the maps he'd drawn there. And he started down the hill. Now, when we went up, we had a rough idea. The U.S. government was actually digging on the wrong hill a quarter mile away, and this is the reason we wanted to try this. Mr. Tuan walked up. We didn't cue him at all. We didn't slow up. And he went to a place, and I'll show you a little bit later. He went to this spot, which ended up being relatively close to where we believe his remains were. And I think what's amazing, Steve caught this. Tuan is looking back. He like, this is it, and we believed that he was very close to the spot. And I was kind of doing holy crap, this guy's walking right to the place. But it was an interesting exercise. And so what we did when we got down there is his entourage, he was very famous and he brought a bunch of people with him. They put out these sacrifices, not sacrifices, but these enticements to lure Tom's wandering soul to the place. And it was interesting to me, there was even this votive money here that they would burn. And, you know, it was very beautiful, actually. They asked that we get together and commemorate. It was very moving for me. I was not only them trying to help us when they had so many issues of their own, but just their obvious generosity. This is very interesting to me, and I'm not going to do the connections I went through in researching this book and writing it. Even when I was writing it a second time, I was shaking my head at how did these things occur, the timing and so forth. But this one story I think is very interesting. This was an NVA soldier who had fought, my age, who had fought the American Army at a place called Tay Ninh, which was further south from us, close to the Cambodian border. And he told us all this through a translator. And down when we left, we hiked up the hill for about 2 miles. And when we were down there, he asked if he could join us to honor this American. He was on his way with this group to find his brother's remains in a place called the Ah Sha Valley, which is about 20 miles from Khe Sanh, and any Vietnam vets here know that place. So he, when we buried that plaque and some of the offerings, as you can see, he's got his hands in the dirt and he's burying it, and he was very respectful. This is him when we were walking back down the hill. And boy, the guy, you know, he was wearing a uniform and he had dress shoes on and everything. But what's interesting about this is when it was quite a long walk, and when we got down to the bottom where it was more jungly, there was a stream there that we'd cross going the other way. And on the embankment, the far embankment was about 3 or 4 feet high. It was very slippery. And so I got there, one of the first people to get there. So I jumped up, I worked my way up, and I anchored my right arm on a tree, and I was helping people up. There were about 8, 9 people that came up with us. And as he showed up, I guess he'd been digging in the dirt, and he'd taken out a knife. And he was, I presume he was cleaning his fingernails because it was a knife about this long. But it was in his hand, and when I pulled him up, his hand, you know, to gain his balance, his hand came up in an arc, and the knife stopped about right here. And he wasn't intending to intimidate me. He probably had forgotten. And our faces were this close, and you know, I could see the mortification in his face. But I could also see that we knew that 40 years ago, you know, he would not thought a second finishing that job off. And again, it's one of those moments out of many that stick in my mind. And he was very mortified by doing that. But that also helped me kind of understand that, you know, there wasn't a lot of animosity there anymore. This lady I just show you for a minute is she just died last year. She's a Buddhist nun. Her name is Thich Nhat Hanh, and she had prepared an altar in the city of Hue for Tom. He'd fought there before Khe Sanh, and up to the time of her death, they still have that there. I've had people come back and say it's still there. She is a wonderful woman. She runs a school there for children who are congenitally damaged by Agent Orange. I mean, we're talking 3rd and 4th generation. And when I went there, I visited them, and it's terrible to see these poor kids in that condition. And yeah, I kind of asked one of them. I said, "Well, you know, there's only 25 kids here. Are you sure it's Agent Orange?" And they said 8 of them or more from the same village. And so that's pretty. But wonderful lady. I'm getting to the end here. I just wanted to, while we were at Khe Sanh, I mentioned that my first battle was, I was set out as a new guy. This is the district headquarters compound as it was when I arrived there, and the defenses were very meager, as you could say. We were very fortunate to survive. Actually, the only reason we survived, we were so outnumbered, was we called in a prearranged artillery attack of variable time fuse, which just rained shrapnel down on these guys, and that's what saved my life. This is what it looks like today. There was another part of this story, but I want to get to the reading. But needless to say, this was another issue I had to get past. I stood across the road where I'd just taken that picture 45 years later, And when I left there after this 2-day battle, you know, I went out to count bodies on this west side of the perimeter where I was, and I remembered I could count them and I could see the poses they were in, but when I left I couldn't remember any of their faces, and maybe they were head down. One of them was kneeling straight up, so I must have seen his face, and I couldn't remember it for the rest of my life. And so when we went into Quezon Village, and I used a map and odometer and everything and found this, I was worried that I'd start to maybe see those faces again, and I didn't want that to happen. But as we were standing there, a bunch of school kids came walking down. They were all wearing sandals, but they had white pressed shirts and little scarlet bandanas, and they were all laughing and holding hands, and they completely ignored us. And I have to tell you that that was kind of the moment, you know, that I got over this first battle. I got over the fact that I'd never see those faces again, because the children's laughter just, you know, it wrecked the moment, I guess, if I wanted to go back to the dark side. And another healing moment. The last part of this is very, very interesting. I started, because North Vietnamese records were now available and well translated, I began tracking down the people that killed my friend. And there were 5 of them to begin with. And the last surviving member is a gentleman by the name of Nguyen Tien Than. And he lives in Hanoi. He's a construction engineer, highway construction engineer, and doing very well, I might add. He was a Catholic, grew up a Catholic, and tried to flee when the Catholics immigrated to the South. He tried to get out and couldn't. He got as far as Haiphong and had to return. So he joined the Pavan Army. He remained a Catholic, and he was, as a result of that, his Marxist political officers, were constantly on him, impugning him, but he managed. He didn't waver. He still is. In fact, he's building a church in his neighborhood right now. The point being, though, that it never occurred to us. I was raised a Catholic, so was Tom. That the 2 altar boys would be shooting it out in Vietnam against one another. We all believed that these soldiers fighting for Ho Chi Minh were godless automatons, brainwashed, no families, no life, no love, which was of course ridiculous. But I carried that with me for many, many years till I finally decided that doesn't make sense. Mr. Mr. Than, I interviewed him 3 times by telephone. I had a translator go there for me. I couldn't go, and he was very helpful. He was making hot chocolate and tea for them right now. But these are the kind of things that we never thought about when we were killing these folks, and they were trying to kill us, that they might have a girlfriend back home. That later became his wife, and they're just, it was a, I know it probably seems like an easy thing to do nowadays to treat people like they're all the same, that we're all and practice empathy, but when you're drilled not to, it takes a while to. These are heartbreaking for me. Mr. Than became so successful despite not getting rank for his religion that he won a decoration for killing, and they had bounties. They have a name of this, for killing 25 Americans over the course of the war, and he was very effective at that. And so he was taken to Hanoi, back to Hanoi, and given an award. This is him here, right behind Ho Chi Minh. This is General Giap over here, and they sent the rest of them to Moscow for special forces training, but he couldn't go again because of his religion. And again, the fact that guys had the courage to do this, that they weren't all the robots that I thought they were, was startling to me. Well, anyway, I jumped a little ahead on this, but one of the 25 Americans, I don't know if Tom Mahoney was counted or not, but he was, Mr. Than was in that group. And although he says he didn't squeeze the trigger, Tom was shot twice in the heart. And again, going back, I touched on it before, but Tom walked outside the wire, and this was another amazing thing. And I found an NVA report that described in graphic detail the 246th Independent Regiment, Tom's face as they shot him. And we kept a lot of reports, but it was more about body counts. But and Wayne, I was honored that you even used that in the book. It's so extraordinary, but in Wayne's book, Wandering Souls. But it describes his face was red and his eyes were squinty like a mean animal. And I knew Tom, and I knew that meant he was under some serious emotional distress. And I think the combination of having to give up Quezon after the huge sacrifices that everyone had made there to hold it for a mere 15 months, and the untimely Dear John letter he'd gotten from his girlfriend, who was studied on the East Coast now, was very engaged in the anti-war movement, and called him a baby killer. And we had never heard that term until we got back to the United States. But it was devastating for Tom. I'm sure he didn't know what it meant, but it was a bad day. So the Marines went out. His friends, as I told you, they adored the guy, and they went out to get him, and they fought all afternoon. They exchanged hand grenades, gunfire. 3 of the Marines were badly wounded, but survived. And due to the directive from above, they had to leave that hill at dark, and so they left him behind. It was just it was a dreadful event upon a dreadful event, because now they had to leave something personal behind. And that's why when I contacted them years later, the minute I started talking to them, they instantaneously started sobbing. So they carried that afternoon, the ability not to bring him home forever. And they were all very successful, mind you. One of them, Alan Williams, became a very successful television and actor, and was in some major films, being there in a few films. All the others, one of them ended up getting a PhD. So we're not talking about guys that went out and lived under the bridge and bemoaned this. They had successful lives, but carried this this incredible pain with them. And I think, I don't know if I mentioned it, but one of the people I quote, a UC Berkeley professor, Cynthia Enlow, kind of summed this all up. She said, all wars end inside families. And this sounds like, it's a good aphorism and whatnot, but I had to find this out, and all the evidence that led me to believe this, every one of these people that I came across were disturbed their entire life by survivor's guilt. And I'm sure it affected their families, their marriages, their children probably carried a lot of it with them. Wars go on after the shooting stops. This is just kind of unusual, and I don't even know if you can tell what it is, but this is a picture of Hill 881, where from the other hill, this is a hill where the government had been digging until 2014. And I kept telling them that he was killed over here, right to the right of that smoke. Actually, it's amazing. This is during the siege. You can actually see an incoming round impacting here. But the bureaucratic red tape and some bad management wouldn't listen to me. Well, as I said, congressional hearings in 2013 just completely revamped them. And when they did that, they went onto shelves in their office, and they found the remains of 2 people that were killed at Quezon on the shelf. They had the bones. They just didn't look. So they went up here. What this is, I find this amusing, right? The Marine Corps Museum across in Triangle, Virginia, have in their Vietnam War exhibit, they have this mural. When you step out, if any of you've been there, when you step out of the back of the helicopter, and it has the heated tropical air and the throbbing of the propellers. It's very realistic. You look out on this, and when I went there, I said, "Oh my God!" I said, "This is 30 minutes down the road from Crystal City, from the Pentagon, where the office of the Defense Secretary is, who heads up this agency that's looking for him." And I'm sure those people walk through there many times and look straight at the spot I've been trying to tell them to look, and never dawned on them. But all's well that ends well. They went in 2014. They took 2 eyewitnesses that I arranged for them to take. That being now the new agency is called the JPAA, the Joint POW MIA Accountability Agency, and they found a spot that had every indication of the grenade duel that went on to recover his body still there. So they're going to go budget. Hopefully, the budget will be there for them to go back in August of this year and look for him. And if they're going to find him, they've really pinpointed the spot. It was so frustrating for so long. I'd like to take a little pride in it, but it's like, thank you. It's all I could think. Please. But they did. In the end, they did. I still think he might be on the shelf. Not to get, too morbid, but Vietnam after the war was very, very poor, and bone collectors would go out and find bones, and they would sell them. And that's how these bones ended up in Honolulu and Hickam Field in a warehouse that the JPA found. one of the sets of bones that was recovered was a man by the name of Billy Hill, and that battle I told you in the village, he was in a relief force that was coming to help us, so they were all shot up the minute they tried to land, and his body remained behind, and they identified him. That was important to me, and I'm hoping Tom will be next. I'll end here, and I think I gave you enough information to get this. So this is taken in 2014, an aerial photo of Hill 881 South. You can't really see the depression here too much, but this is the hill from which that picture was taken. This is the wrong hill, and this is the tents of the excavation that they were doing. And this is where Tom really is, and all my research and all the eyewitnesses I tracked down shows a pretty clear indication. This is no excavation. This happened to be tents of indigenous workers where they were living. Well, those pictures you saw of Mr. Boutouin, the psychic, where he found it, was looking up at us, is right here. So it's conceivable, but not likely, that, and he said there were 3 teeth there, and that was it. It's conceivable that that he could be right. I couldn't explain that. I still don't believe in the paranormal, but that doesn't matter. The fact is, he is within an easy possibility of that happening. And as Wayne pointed out in his book about Dom, you know, the Americans and the North Vietnamese, if they had to stay in a place for a while, for hygienic reasons, it was nothing for them to take a body and toss it down the other side of the hill, just to, you know, for obvious reasons. And also, his teeth also could have been blown over there by subsequent. I'm not saying it is, but I tell you, it's pretty sad when a department of the U.S. government keeps digging over here. A telepath tells you it's here, and he's actually here. I found that to be very, very interesting. One thing I would like to add before I get shamelessly commercial here, but is that a Marine came forward in 2010 by the name of Al Malmasolo. He called me and he said, "I buried your friend." I said, "I'm the guy you've been looking for. I buried your friend." He had gone to the JPAC, the government agency, looking for him, and they believed him. They interviewed him for hours. And I did my own independent research and found that while there was no report of the burial, he was actually in the unit he claimed to be at the time he claimed to be. And so he claimed that they got there on a mission just after dusk, and that he literally came down on top of the body and moved it into a hole and covered it up with his K-bar, with his knife. He and his corporal who was leading that reconnaissance team. And when he went there, because it was dark, and I feel as Al thought it was on the other knoll. The knolls are almost identical and run this way, but it was in the place it would have been had it been the right place. So that was very interesting to me. And one thing, again, it's so fascinating, some of this stuff. If you keep probing, Al didn't remember this grisly incident until he was taking his family to the Grand Canyon, and this is in 2006, and he was getting in a helicopter, and as the chopper blade started winding up, he yelled to the pilot, "Land," and he got his family off, and he said, "I buried an American," and it was the first time it ever flashed into his mind in 40 years. Anyway, so again, there's many, many more nuances to this that I almost found it hard to explain, but it's a fascinating story, and I hope, excuse me, I hope we'll find a conclusion. I'd love to read a couple of excerpts. The first one is about what Tom, who was in a rifle company, what life was like for him when he got there. I was a little different. I was in a regimental, I was a radio operator and was sent out. I wasn't humping the fields with a backpack on. Okay, the NVA were especially adept in sophisticated ambushes, employing a high level of preparation and fire discipline, waiting until American patrols were within a few meters of them before opening fire. Now, this tactic limited the use of supporting artillery or air attacks from U.S. bombers and helicopters for fear of hitting their own forces in the vicinity. Marine rifle platoons constantly patrolled in the bush with only brief respites in relatively secure areas where they were provided hot food and showers and slept in a tent or hut. The rest of the time they were out in the field where the terrain and weather of Vietnam made their life miserable beyond description. Whenever a patrol stopped for more than a short time, the wary Marines and corpsmen dug foxholes to avoid injury or death from the flurry of enemy mortar shells that invariably followed. Although the men were constantly exhausted by their daily labor of hiking through the villages along steep ridge lines, across boot-sucking rice paddies, sleep did not come easily, nor was it adequate for keeping their wits sharp. Even in the best conditions, when the weather was bearable, enemy pressure was light, and there were fewer of the ubiquitous mosquitoes, centipedes, rats, snakes, and other toxic vermin biting, stinging, and slithering over them at night. They rarely managed to get more than 2 hours sleep at a time due to the nightly requirements of manning ambushes, listening posts, and perimeter guard duty. During the hot season, carrying weapons and gear and ammo, a typical infantryman could lose 20% of their body weight. Parasites like leeches and hookworms were common, as were debilitating diseases like malaria, dysentery, and trench foot. In the cooler, rainy monsoon season, they battled influenza and ailments of the lung due to mold and fungus. Casualty rates in these units due to wounds and disease ran as high as 70%. The Marines shared the load of their ammunition necessary for the weapons they took on patrol, which in addition to small arms fire and grenades could include heavy belts of machine gun ammunition, mortar shells, and mines. They possessed few personal items since the additional weight magnified the difficulty of the march. While other U.S. military personnel also engaged in high-risk occupations in the Vietnam War, including those in aviation, none lived a more wretched or precarious existence than the men of a Marine rifle platoon. Along with their physical ordeal, there was a persistent fear of injury or death or capture. The elusiveness of the enemy was particularly frustrating. Marines rarely knew their presence until a booby trap explosion maimed or killed some of them, or a sudden ambush erupted on an exposed flank with murderous rifle or machine gun fire and a shower of hand grenades. For this reason, they bore the nagging concern that they might not meet the challenge, later described by combat veteran and author Tim O'Brien as, quote, the common secret of cowardice barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide. In some respects, he wrote, it was probably the most difficult burden of all, for it could never be put down. They were too frightened to be cowards. Fast forward to my return to the United States and after having to face Tom, Mom, and it was around Christmas time. It was 2 days before Christmas, and it couldn't have been more poignant. Jeez. Because my hometown, I meant to say, I grew up in Oakland and Berkeley, California. When I got back, the war had, when I left in 1967, it was kind of a peaceful anti-war movement. And in the 1 year between 1967 and late 1968, I got back, and it seemed to me that they were actually endorsing our enemy, supporting our enemy. There were Viet Cong flags flying. They named a park after Ho Chi Minh. The Berkeley City Council did. I was twitching all the time for the first few weeks. But I write here that because my hometown now bred within me so many bad feelings, I moved to Sacramento, California in the fall of 1970 and attended American River College and later California State University. I majored in history largely because I felt more comfortable in the distant past than in the present. I did well in my studies and voraciously consuming all the information I could, believing that in knowledge I might find some logic in what had happened to me and my friend. I enjoyed the college environment despite being philosophically unacceptable to most of my classmates and professors by questioning the altruistic motives of the North Vietnamese communists and other Cold War adversaries. Soon frustrated, I quit discussing it and my resentment grew. I often tried to see things through Tom's eyes, wondering how he would have handled it, such disillusionment. If he had been able to overcome the dual emotional blows in July of 1968 of his sense of betrayal by the U.S. government and its military leaders at what he was witnessing in the chaotic final days of Quezon, and then the painful rejection by his girlfriend for having fought in the war, would he have been less disappointed or resentful about it than me? The bitterness I felt was understandably magnified by the fact that he was not there, and in my knowledge of the despair he experienced just before dying. It was not that I felt responsible for his death, for I had long before conceded that luck determined who walked away from the slaughter at Quezon. Rather, it was a localized form of survivor's guilt that had me convinced that the better person had not come home. Instead of the charming, confident, handsome, and optimistic young man for whom doors would have opened the rest of his life, the world got me. Tom's trust in me to share with him what we naively thought would be a splendid adventure had given me my first taste of truly believing in myself. Now, 3 years later, I returned home devoid of confidence, exhibiting self-destructive behaviors like heavy smoking and binge drinking, and seeking out the dirtiest, most arduous jobs I could find to help pay my way through college. On sweltering summer days in the Sacramento Valley, I would routinely offload 15 tons of animal feed, one 50 or 75-pound sack at a time, from a steel-walled railroad boxcar in which the oven-like interior temperatures often exceeded 160 degrees. On other days, I would hoist 9 tons of hay onto a flatbed truck and then drag each bale with hooks into dusty, airless, stifling barns or other storage facilities at ranches around the valley, the sharp alfalfa stems ripping deep scratches in my arms and face that stung all day from the salt and my sweat. It was the worst work I could find, but not penance enough for having been the wrong one to survive. I hoped that by immersing myself in such grueling manual labor, I would forget about the war, unaware that experts treating combat-related stress disorders had determined that such filthy, hot, painfully laborious, and mindlessly repetitive activity was so close to the Vietnam experience, it was precisely what I should not have been doing. And I would like one last one. That was the low point, one of the low points in my life. But I would like to go fast forward to when I was dealing with all my new information, and Wayne was very helpful, as I said, in helping me understand this. Wayne's experiences had helped me sort out the conflicting feelings I now faced, which after my recent visit to Vietnam, sorrow, relief, the unexpected warmth and concern by former NVA soldiers such as Dr. Din Tuan. But like Wayne, I also harbored reservations about the validity of psychic powers. Quote, "I feel the same way as you do," he later wrote me. "I'm a skeptic who wants to believe." As much as I would like to have disagreed with Wayne's observations that I wanted to believe, there appears to have been some truth in that. Back in January 21st, 1968, while sitting on the floor of the communications bunker in Quezon Village, in despair that I would probably not live through the night after learning our reinforcements had just been ambushed, I looked down and saw a Kennedy $50 pressed into the mud floor. I survived that night, and though I did not really believe the coin had been responsible for that, I was now afraid to part with it. As an 8th grader in March of 1962, I had gone to hear President John F. Kennedy speak at Memorial Stadium on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. Because it had long been considered a breeding ground for communists, the Secret Service considered the city unsafe. And so despite being a warm, clear day, the president arrived in a transparent bubble top, which those of you who know the history, a year later, they didn't put the bubble top on and he was assassinated. But back to this. Later, as he stepped to the podium in the center of the football field, I was surprised to discover he was a redhead because we didn't have color television in those days. After his speech, Kennedy departed through a nearby gate, and I joined the other kids running up to the rim of the stadium to look down on his car. He tilted his head back and waved at us through the plastic. After meeting Tom Mahoney a few months later, I learned that he was in the audience also and that he might have been among the kids jostling for a peek at the president. I was awed at seeing the president, and so his assassination the following year left me cynical and depressed. This in turn led to a series of reckless life choices and eventually Quezon. So when I saw that Kennedy silver visage gleaming out of the damp mud floor that very bad night in the village, it had the feel of a mystical experience. On the day I left Vietnam, I checked the buttoned pocket that I had used to keep that coin in each day for the last year and discovered it had somehow vanished since I had checked on it the day before. It just mysteriously gone. And I'd kept it for 8 months. During my return to Vietnam in 2007, to the site of the battle for the district headquarters had taken place, I could not shake the totally irrational feeling that despite last seeing the coin 38 years before and 100 miles to the south, I was about to look down and suddenly find it again. This sensation persisted until we were back in the van and driving away, but left me momentarily in a dizzying, disorienting panic that my personal reality had nearly come undone. I was too embarrassed to tell Doc and Steve about this, but my Vietnamese friends would not have been surprised by the scenario, confident that Tom's mischievous, wandering soul not only was responsible for the disappearance of the coin from my pocket 4 decades before, but was, by distracting me with his bizarre expectancy, now communicating his approval of my quest to bring him home. While I remain unconvinced of the effectiveness of paranormal involvement, I know that until the day Tom's remains are found, we cannot rule out with absolute certainty the location identified by Nguyen Bu Tuan. I'm grateful to him, Thich Newman Tan, Nguyen Thi Du Van, and Dr. Din Van Tuan, and others at the CHIC, and profoundly touched by their sincerity and quiet dignity and compassion in helping ease the pain of Tom's family and friends by trying to reach a single soul among the countless that they still believe wander their land. I begin to wonder that if, in that journey back to the place where I'd lost my youth, innocence, and best friend, I may have inadvertently found a little part of myself that died there. In that context, perhaps 2 wandering souls were working their way home. Thank you.